Welcome back, amazing, beautiful people, to another episode of The Hopeful Majority. Today, we've got on a fascinating guest, Batya Ungar-Sargon. She's the deputy opinion editor at Newsweek, a columnist, a prominent influencer, thought leader, and actually also the author of two books, the most recent of which is called The Second Class: How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. This episode is back to regular programming. If you're new to the show, usually what we have is interviews and conversations, and then every other week we have a monologue from me about a specific topic. Now, obviously, last week we had the tragic assassination attempt on President Trump's life, and we had the RNC. Now, this conversation I thought was particularly relevant to this moment because I think we live at a time now where we are affording a level of sympathy and empathy to our political opponents that we were not affording 15 to 20 days ago, before the assassination attempt on President Trump's life. And I think we're at this unique moment, the silver lining, if you call it that, out of the tragedy on that Saturday and the subsequent events that have happened over the last week and the progress that we've made in our politics, is that I don't think the silver lining is necessarily that we'll find unity or compromise, but I think it is that we're willing to afford people that we disagree with a little bit more of a chance to better understand their perspective, their ideas. Now, Batya is somebody that supports President Trump and also somebody that believes that he is a unity consensus candidate. And I'm sure some people listening to the show right now love that idea. Some people probably really disagree with that idea. Here's the value in this moment. I think we live at a time where we have to understand the people that we disagree with. And I do this with people on the left, do this with people on the right, do this independents. Batya, I think, is an independent thought leader, somebody that thinks deeply, and someone, as she articulates, does the work because she believes that's what our country asks for. And I think that's a sincere intention. And so I think this is a fascinating conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Let's welcome Batya to the show. Batya, welcome to the Hopeful Majority.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. I'm such a fan of yours and the work that you're doing. This project of unity and bringing people together has never been more important.
It means a lot to me, and I'll tell you one thing, Batya, which is that I mean we're very young right now, but when we were even younger, you were one of the first folks out, in, I guess you could call it, the influencer world or the opinion making world that actually responded to my persistent emails and actually paid attention. And so I just want you to know that, given how quickly the news moves, given how quickly the world moves, I've always had a genuine sort of sweet spot and belief in sort of what you're doing because of how much attention you pay to our work when no one else did. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. That really means a lot to me.
So as we were just talking in the pre-prep, I know you're very busy. What could we possibly be talking about? And I just want to timestamp this conversation for the audience. This is Monday, July 15th. So the news is very quickly always altering and shifting. But can I just ask, where were you on Saturday? What were you doing when the assassination attempt on President Trump's life took place?
So it was Shabbat, which means my phone was off, and my rabbi had stopped by on Shabbos afternoon, which he often does, for a few glasses of wine and some talk about Torah and spirituality and politics. And so I think actually at 6:11, which is when it happened, we were probably knee deep in a debate about Donald Trump over a few glasses of wine.
Oh man.
And then, he left, and my husband and I went about, the rest of our Shabbat. We prayed, we ate a little bit more. And then, Shabbat ended around, I want to say 9:15. And of course, the second Shabbat ends, I run to my computer, run to my phone, turn it on, and I turned on the TV, and I was like, I called to my husband immediately and said, "Oh my God, Donald Trump has been shot," and sat and watched that, footage of him being shot and then standing up and saying, first he said, no, let me get my shoes. He didn't want to leave the stage without his shoes. And then he refused to leave the stage without letting the American people know he was okay, which honestly brought tears to my eyes. And then I, of course, had to follow up on the conversation as it was happening. I immediately got booked on a bunch of TV shows and started writing a column for Spiked and, catching up on how the conversation was developing.
So we're going to get into the substance of what happened, obviously the implications. I mean, there is so much to get into as it relates to the cycle of polarization, as it relates to how did we get here? What are the implications moving forward? Before all of that though, I'm just curious. Um I know very few people who take a day in their week where there's no technology and then at like 6:11 you said or 9:15 or whatever the timestamp was, you ran to your phone. I just take, this is a Gen Z audience, right, Batya? And this idea of being away from, the dopamine box for like 11 hours is a fascinating concept. Can you just explain like what it's like to be in the news industry but then actually take a step back away from your phone for 11 hours, then what it's like coming back into the world? Do you feel this intransient experience? What's that like?
It's actually for 25 hours.
Okay,
It
25.
starts Friday night. The Jewish day starts the night before. So
Uh-huh.
sundown Friday until sundown Saturday is 25 hours where there's no technology. I am begging you all to try it just once. What it does is not only does it cleanse you spiritually and morally, but it forces you to create community around yourself, because of course it's very difficult to do nothing for 25 hours. And so you have to invite friends over, you have to go to synagogue, you have to spend time with your loved ones. It just creates this pressure to be out in the world having real conversations where nobody is looking at their phones. And I am simply begging you to try it
Mhm.
just once. It doesn't have to be Shabbos Saturday. It could be Sunday. It could be whatever day you want it to be. But it is the most unbelievable experience. And we have a saying in the Jewish community that, more than the Jews kept the Shabbos kept the Jews, because there is something about it that just protects you. We're in such a, minute to minute world, and to simply have 25 hours where everything has to happen the old way. Every piece of news you get has to come from a newspaper. Every book you read has to be in hard copy, where you're forced to really disconnect from that and answer to a higher power, answer to yourself, develop an inner world. There are many hours in these
Mhm.
long days of the summer where you're just lying on the couch and thinking about things. And I am begging you to try it just once. 25 hours. It really, really does protect you emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, and it adds so much to my life. And then of course, like the rush of getting back online and say, oh, who said what? What is it? What happened?
Uh-huh.
Rushing to see everything that happened over the 25 hours that you were offline. It's a really cool experience, and you encounter the news then in a very different way.
There's only one other piece that I want to stick on this for 1 second, and then we will go to what it's like to enter the news cycle in one of the most historic periods in probably a very long time, which is how do you avoid the anxiety of missing out on what's happening in the world? How do you avoid the anxiety of something terrible is happening and I need to go check the phone? I find a lot of people in my generation, yes, part of it is, being addicted to social media, being addicted to news. Part of it is there's this just like this mental health crisis going on where people have developed an almost an addiction to knowing what is going on all the time. Do you ever get that at all? Are you able to navigate that?
I'll one up it, which is sometimes I try not to tweet actually now on Friday, because I know what's going to happen is like at 7 p.m. I've turned my phone off, and sometimes I'll be in the midst of getting like totally canceled or ratioed on like everyone is coming at me, and you just have to turn it off and not know what millions of people are saying
Wow.
about you for 25 hours. Or like I did Bill Maher's show, which films an hour before Shabbat it ends. So I went back to my hotel. It doesn't air until 10 p.m. So I knew that this was going to air to millions and millions of people, and I was going to have no idea what people were saying about me for 24 hours. And that is like, it's very hard for sure, because one of the ways we deal with the anxiety of being talked about, especially in a very negative way, being dogpiled on Twitter, what have you, is just knowing, you know what I mean? And it really teaches you, like, I don't know about you, but I think that it's really not rock and roll to be sitting there reading comments or like reading what people are saying about you, to be so tied to the negativity of what every stupid troll thinks about you. And it really creates this practice where you're
Mm.
like, actually, that's none of my business. Like, my job is to say the truth to the best of my ability. It is none of my business, like, what other people want to say about me as a result of that. I don't actually need to know that. And it's so important because so
Mm.
many journalists, and I'm sure you've noticed this, they have audience capture. This is
Yes.
especially true of like independent journalists on YouTube. They become an embodiment of the YouTube comment section because their audience is speaking directly back to them. And so all of their views now coalesce, or they all are a direct reflection of the very homogenous, very global YouTube audience, which actually is not very American at all. And it's really important not to let that happen to you. And the only way you can do that is to have a spiritual praxis of saying, I answer to a higher power. I just answer to someone else other than, the like hashtag resistance Twitter or the MAGA
Hmm.
Twitter, or the people who are like considered to be cool in this journalistic arena or that arena. You have to distance yourself from that while having your say, while exercising your free speech right to have your say. And that is a very difficult thing to do. And it's really, really it's very hard and very important, like most things in life.
That's right. I mean, when you think about audience capture, especially at this moment where people feel like they are being led by the comment section. So then almost your commentary or analysis becomes a response to what people are saying. And then you're
Totally.
like hooked to it. I can only imagine. I mean, when the assassination attempt happened and in the subsequent hours, and this seems to be the case, Batya, with every news story ever at this point, where people jump to make the take the fastest, which then drives engagement influence. And then the truth almost gets lost in that process because you're like, my audience wants me to say something. My audience wants me to say
Totally.
something. And then you jump into it. Can you talk a little bit about how you navigate that personally
Yeah.
and what your input is to younger leaders that are rising up right now that are trying to build their influence, that are trying to build and grow their platforms to not fall victim to that?
I'll give you one example, which is after October 7th, which prior to the assassination attempt on Trump, I think was the most historic thing I've lived through. I didn't, well, it was Shabbat when it happened, and then it was a
Mhm.
holiday. So I was offline for actually 48 hours before I
Oh,
found
man.
out about it. When I came back online, I didn't know what to say. And
Mm.
so I said nothing. I think it took me 4 days to think of what I wanted to say. And yeah, you see everybody else having takes, and you're like, oh, is that my take? Is that the thing I should have said? And especially you see stuff going viral, and you think, oh, is this what is my role here? What can I add to this conversation? And my answer in that moment was nothing. And I knew that a lot of people were waiting to hear my reaction as, an influencer, both in the American space and in the Israel Jewish space, what have you. And it took a lot of discipline, but I just didn't want to say something stupid.
Mm.
I didn't want to not meet the moment. And for me in that moment, meeting the moment meant waiting until I knew what I wanted to say. And that took time. And
Mm.
honestly, I think I only figured it out after my first TV hit, which was, so there were the 2 days that I was offline, and then I was sort of collecting my thoughts. I got asked to do TV, and then it sort of started to get very constant after that. And then I had to come up with something to say, and that
Mhm.
was when I sort of knew what my approach was going to be. But similarly with the assassination attempt, I didn't tweet the Saturday night. I
I
waited
actually remember.
until
I know this because I was like, I'm speaking with Batya on Monday, and I forgot about it too because again, to your point, nowadays on weekends, like I really try to unplug and center myself and try to like remember like why are we even doing what we're doing, right? And I actually was like, I was checking my calendar right beforehand. I was picking my friend up from the airport. I looked at my calendar. I was like, oh my God, I'm talking to Batya on Monday. Let me see what she's saying on Twitter. And I actually tracked that. And I noticed that you didn't put out anything until now I'm like going to stalker territory, but you didn't put out anything until like Saturday evening late, or maybe it was Sunday morning.
So it was actually Sunday morning. I was asked to do a TV hit very early Sunday morning. So I had to be up for that. I had to have something to say for that. I then turned that into a column, and then I
Hmm.
knew what I wanted to say. But I would say, like, the advice I would give, and this is very hard advice to follow. I don't always follow it. I'm not always perfect. The advice I would give is um what does my country, my nation, my community, my people need from me right now? And if you don't have a clear answer to that, don't say anything. It's not what do I need to say right now? It's
Mm,
what can I add to a nation that is hurting right now? And I'm going to tell you the thing that I struggle with the most, honestly. It's not, I used to struggle with not, honestly, it's like, I'd have a few drinks and I'd like start tweeting. No, that's a terrible idea. Or the even worse, I learned this the hard way is being at the gym, especially after cardio, you're full of endorphins and you think every thought you have is genius. And you're
you're
like,
you're
oh,
invincible.
exactly. And don't tweet there either. But now I think the thing that I struggle with the most is it seems to me that there's sort of two options in any moment. And it is to speak to your audience, to give the people who agree with you the best, sharpest, clearest version of what they believe, which is often very scathing, let's say,
Mhm,
or to speak in the softest, gentlest possible way. So people who disagree with you maybe will be convinced and join you or hear the truth in what you're saying. This is a choice that one has to make every time we open our mouths. I can either, if I'm doing a hit on Fox, I can either say what the Fox audience knows is true, what I believe is true, in the most scathing, concise way possible to make them feel like, oh, at least somebody gets it, right?
mhm.
Or I can speak in a way that hopefully people who are on the other side could hear it in the most kind and generous way to the other side. And it is not sometimes the first of those is appropriate and sometimes the second is appropriate. For someone like me who feels that the vast majority of the media is really against the truth and really bad at telling the truth, because I feel like, oh, I'm the underdog, against the whole media.
Mm,
Sometimes it is appropriate to be extremely scathing and to give average people voice to their frustrations when they feel like nobody will tell the truth. But other times it is much better to try to speak it in the most gentle way possible so that possibly people on the other side will be able to hear you. And that is really like the thing that I'm struggling with right now is,
yes.
especially in this moment where I want to take responsibility for bringing down the temperature. I want to be, a person who is unifying the country, not dividing the country. But on the other hand, I feel so angry at
Mhm.
what one side has allowed to happen to this country. And so I'm really struggling with what is the best way to speak right now. And that is the thing that I just don't know and I pray every morning, like to God, like help me know what the right way to say what I think is true is. Not that I would ever not tell the truth, but what is the best way to speak the truth in this moment that is both accurate but also unifying and not dividing?
Let's actually dive into that struggle because I think that actually gets the core of the problem that we're in right now in society. So, Batya, I remember in 2017 when we'd started our first ever like bridge dialogue and discussion. And again, for context, you might not know this, but I was a pre med student. I had like zero interest in
Wow.
politics or democracy or any of this stuff. And in 2017 at UC Berkeley, second semester, we had a speaker by the name of Milo Yiannopoulos come to campus. And Milo, came February 2nd. It led to some of the largest protests in Berkeley's history. The next day, me and some random people who are now some of my best friends, we were just like, the campus community is hurting and people are struggling exactly with that question. And I think actually every news event we struggle with this question in society because the more and more closer we get to knife's edge, people feel like lowering the temperature becomes in conflict with your passion. And so I remember we held this first discussion, right? And the students came up to us afterwards and they're like, we were so existentially at risk because of the speaker's speech. How could you possibly have the conversation? And it really got me thinking about the question that you're asking, which is how do you get to a point where we can challenge the issues that we deeply care about and fight polarization at the same time. And I feel like we're the people that are pushing this work like me that are focused on creating unity, and I don't even necessarily like that word. I think one of the things we have to start doing is articulating that conflict is actually good. It's a question of how we have that conflict, right? And what it means to actually have healthy conflict. And so I want to ask you, given that you've come from a viewpoint where you feel like you're the underdog, where you feel like the media is has a hard time telling the truth, and you feel like one side is largely contributed to what happened on Saturday, how do you wrestle with the
I know.
pull and the tension? Um, what is your
A
perspective on that?
and I would
What does your country want you to do at this moment from
Right, and
you?
I would even amp it up even further because I wrote this book second class where I traveled around the country for a year
Mhm,
interviewing working class people from across the political perspective spectrum. And what I found was like there's huge consensus in the working class. Like all polarization is an elite phenomenon effectively. Like there's just no polarization among working class people. Some of them disagree on certain things, some people like Trump, some people don't like Trump, but the idea of hating someone over their politics is like totally foreign to people who don't have a college degree.
mhm,
They by and large they agree on the issues. So they agree on abortion, 15 weeks. They agree on immigration. They want much less of it. They agree on healthcare. They want much more of it. Like there's just no polarization among working class people. And so to me, it's like amped up because I'm like, you have the elites in the media who are telling one story and it's the totally wrong story, and then the vast majority of
mm.
Americans who have been left out of it. And so when I become very scathing in my critique, I feel like I'm actually representing people who don't have a voice, who are like the majority of Americans who have been totally erased. And this is whether they're Democrats or Republicans. So it even amps it up even more, like the desire to sort of speak this truth, because I really feel like I'm speaking truth to power on behalf of the powerless, and that our democracy hangs in the balance. Like you cannot have a democracy without a stable middle class, and we have a shrinking middle class. So
Mhm.
it like amps up even the conflict even more. And it is such a great question when I ask myself every day,
Because you
what
feel that sense of responsibility towards those
exactly,
people.
and that they have been silenced and degraded, and the American dream has been stolen from them by a bunch of millionaires who lie. And like, so that there's something in that construct that is like very true, and yet is the thing my country needs from me right now to speak in a language that those lying millionaires could potentially hear to bring down the temperature. I mean, that is the like the real conflict here is like I'm always railing against the elites, especially the over credentialed elites in the top 20%. I have like huge criticisms of the way that they have mobilized the language of social justice to dispossess working class people of all races and put money in their own pockets. And
Mm.
this critique is, I think it's 100% accurate. And yet people criticize me and say, you can't just throw these people away. Like your whole language of more unites us than divides us. Like speak to them, give your critique in a way that they too can understand it and can accept it. And I have seen this like since the book came out, like I have had, I want to say, 5 or 6 conversations with leftist, liberal people in media where I was able to get them to go, huh, I never thought of Trump that way. Like that,
Hmm.
that is a huge victory. And
Well,
yeah.
right there, let me just ask you if I just put a finer point on the question. What is your objective in representing those people? Like, what do you think success looks like when you're delivering that scathing critique? Is
My
it for that person to maybe understand, you know, the perspective of a Trump supporter? What would you say success looks like?
Well, success for me would look like a reversal of the enormous class divide in America, where you have the top 20% controlling over 50% of the GDP and, 98% of the political agenda. And the reason that I
Mm,
feel motivated to do that
mhm.
is religiously, spiritually, morally, but also I believe in democracy. I'm very scared about our democracy. And the thing that makes the democracy work and strong and stable is that, people feel represented. And right now they don't feel represented because they're not represented. So the goal is to reverse the class divide. And how do you do that? By bringing the working class agenda back into the mainstream, which has been co-opted by the elites. So giving them a voice to me is giving voice to these concerns and making them unignorable again, to reverse that class divide where so much power and money is concentrated in the top.
Yeah, no, I asked that question, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, part of the reason for the show is for different guests to be able to articulate why they pursue the work they pursue. I'm very interested in the question of why, because I think to build hope in this world, to try to build a sense of purpose, I think everybody's got to hear, well, here's why Batya does what she does. And in particular, last week I was at I was speaking to a bunch of high schoolers in Oklahoma at this like leadership institute, right? And they were asking the question, when is violence justified? And again, it goes to this point of, when is scathing critique justified? Should you have scathing
Mhm.
critique right now, or should you try to, hold hands, right?
Mhm.
If you took it the all the way the opposite direction. And to me, I think the fundamental question becomes, well, what is your objective, and what is the road that we need to take at this moment to get there? And I think my argument would be that at this moment, where I think we're fundamentally in a battle between how you create change. I think most people are on your side of, they might disagree with your diagnosis, but I think most people are on the side of, we got to shake up the status quo in some way. And I think that there's two ways to create change, right? You've got this zero sum sort of like, I win. It's not even I win, because that creates self-serving, and I think it doesn't do justice to your position. It's like, we need to forward this perspective right now, because if we don't do it right now, the other side wins. And the alternative is, we got to create coalitions of change to be able to bring people very different perspectives together into one alignment. And I think you would probably make the argument that because you're focused on the working class enables you to tackle polarization in a different way, you're actually building those coalitions. Is that broadly
Yeah,
accurate?
but also, no, I totally think having the conversation is extremely important. And I've advocated for keeping far left views in the discourse and in the public discourse
Right.
because
Right.
they represent a certain percentage of our population and thus they deserve to be heard. The problem is that they now, basically they've kind of taken over like, the discourse, right? And so, but if we were in a situation where there was a sizable chunk of Americans who identified with a certain worldview and they were being deplatformed, I would fight for them as well because I totally agree with you. In a larger sense, in sort of galaxy brain sense, the goal is not just to shrink the class divide, but it's to shrink the class divide without violence, right? It's to shrink the class divide through discourse, through conversation, through organizing, right?
Mhm.
Through coalition building, as you're saying, right? Like that, 100%. It is to find ways to, be Americans, is how I would put
Mhm.
that, right? And what it means to be in America is fundamentally to commit to the idea that you only deserve to win if you convince people. You only deserve to win if you have made the case successfully to more people than doubt what you're saying. That is what I think that is the definition of being an American, right? That is our First Amendment. And that is why it exists. And I feel that so deeply, especially about the people who I disagree with. I could say this, most obviously when it comes to like Israel Palestine, like those people I
Mhm.
disagree with belong at the table. I mean, they have much more of a seat than they have earned because of the way that our elite systems work and our universities work, right? But if they were, when people try to say, silence them through non-democratic means, I don't like that. And I oppose that very, very vociferously.
Mhm.
Same thing with these elites, you want to make the case for open borders. You want to convince Americans that we should have radically more immigration. Do that. The problem is that they have used institutions to circumvent the will of the people. That's not acceptable. And so we should speak up against that. But I think we're sort of agreeing that in the larger sense, the reason I do what I do is because this is the greatest country on earth. And we have to make sure that it stays that way. And doing that means
Mhm.
embracing what it means to be an American, which means committing to the only way to achieve political ends is through conversation, through
That's right.
speech, and through debate.
And I mean, I think ultimately the core of healthy conflict is that people that are engaged in that conflict have a sincerity towards their belief. And I think your
Mhm.
question, what does your country demand of you at this moment? I think irrespective of what somebody listening to you right now thinks of your perspective, at least can hang their hat on, Batya cares about the security and stability of this country. And this is why she's saying what she's saying. And I think part of the reason why the discourse has gotten so toxic is because we inherently assign evil intentions to somebody that we disagree with. So the exact argument you're making, I would imagine in a previous time, you have a policy discussion about that argument. It doesn't immediately go to, you are fundamentally evil and here are the points of oppression that you've suddenly triggered and instantiated. And so when I was reading your spiked column, I think you said you put out Sunday, right? So yesterday. I think the byline said, uh, "What this assassination attempt demonstrates is that the real threat to democracy is not coming from Trump. Um, could you dive into that a little bit deeper and maybe articulate from your perspective what is the real threat?
Yeah, I didn't write the subheading. This is maybe something that your audience
No, that's
doesn't know, but yeah,
yes.
but authors don't get to write their own headlines. So everybody who appears in Newsweek, I've written a lot of those people's headlines. They get really mad at me because they're like, "Why did you make this sound so inflammatory?" And I'm
I've
like, "Because I want people to
yeah.
click on it." But yeah, I do believe that. I think that I mean, Donald Trump is an extremely popular politician who we know what he does with power because he did it for 4 years when he was president, and nothing came close to like actually threatening democracy. In fact, what he did was extremely democratic. He took a political system in which both parties had united to oppose the interests of the working class and reversed that and just turned the whole ship around, whether it's immigration or trade, even something like abortion. Donald Trump's position of 15 weeks, this is where 70% of Americans are at. And yet, both parties have abandoned that kind of central position to take up positions that are much more extreme on either side. On so many issues, Donald Trump has reclaimed the center, in the name of the GOP, but it's kind of farcical because he's really running as an independent. And so, to me, calling him a threat to democracy, what they really mean when they say threat to democracy is he's a threat to our power, to our ability to rule. The Democrats, I think, convinced themselves that they would sort of have now, a permanent majority, and were very, very surprised to find out that they had actually lost the working class, and now they've actually lost, the Hispanic working class and huge parts of the Black working class as well. So, to me, that there's a sort of like they use language in order to promote their agenda in a very clever way,
Mhm,
because a lot of them have degrees that teach them how to manipulate language in their own interests. And you can look at the progressive agenda and see how it is, it all sounds like it's about um, high-minded virtues, but actually what it's about is, if you dig a little deeper, is the economic agenda of the elites. And to me, the real threat to democracy here is, they have effectively decided that they do not have to make their case to the American people. They are now using the institutions to do that for them. So, prosecuting Donald Trump on 91 indictments, you could say 91 indictments, surely he's done one of those things, right? Or you could say 91 indictments, wow, they really are not going to stop until they get him on one of those. And by the way, when I say they, I don't mean that there's some sort of coordinated effort coming from Joe Biden or what have you. I really don't think that. I think that these
mhm,
people all have class solidarity as a result of getting multiple
mm.
degrees, and that class solidarity makes them behave in a certain way that I think is pretty anti-democratic.
There's a I was actually just about to ask you if you get very specific on who they is, so I appreciate you doing that piece. Um, I want to actually underscore a thing that you said at the very beginning of your answer that I think a lot of people might miss, but it's something I really want to focus the rest of the conversation on because, um, one, we've got 9 minutes left, and two is because I think that as we go through the next week and 2 weeks, I think there's a unique opportunity for people that might be on the left to better understand why people support Donald Trump. I think there's a unique opportunity right now. And it's not about me apologizing. What I want to do is for people to better understand each other. So you said that what Trump did was fundamentally democratic, which is he came in and turned the ship around in a democratic way. That's something that I think a lot of progressives don't necessarily hear or understand. Could you dive into that a little bit deeper?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think if you're a progressive, you probably think of Donald Trump as somebody who's a very extreme, an extremist.
Hmm.
That's the language that's often associated with him if you get your news from CNN or MSNBC or the New York Times or the Washington Post. The truth is, if you just look at his policies, Donald Trump is a moderate or even a liberal. He looks a lot more, just if you look at policy, he looks a lot more like a 90s era Democrat than he does like a 2020s Republican. So on abortion, we gave that example, right? 15 weeks on abortion. This was the Democrats' position until very, very recently when they started to embrace the idea of choice, right? And the idea of nobody tells a woman when it's no longer appropriate to have an abortion. It used to be that Democrats in the 90s talked about abortion as something that should be very safe and very rare, right? You can't imagine a Democrat today saying abortion should be rare, right? So on abortion, a major cultural issue, Donald Trump is a 90s era Democrat. On immigration, in the 90s, it was the Democrats' position that we should have a strong border and much more limited immigration. Why? Because of supply and demand. The more labor you have, the cheaper that labor is, meaning the less the worker can ask in compensation. The unions in the 90s and the Democrats believed that if you had more immigration, you were inevitably going to lower the wages that working class people could command because you had a larger supply of labor. This happens to be true, by the way. They were right in the 90s, but then they abandoned that view as they abandoned the working class to cater to suburban and college educated voters who are the consumers of low wage labor. So, of course, those people want working class wages to be lower because then they have to pay less for them. And so, as the Democrats shifted from representing the working class to representing the upper middle class, they did a 180 on immigration. But in the 1990s, Bill Clinton appointed a civil rights icon, Barbara Jordan, to do a commission on immigration. And she found that the people most hurt by immigration were Black men, which is something, by the way, Donald Trump has been talking about a lot in his speeches, if you watch the rallies and listen to the speeches. So we have immigration, we have abortion. On trade, it was the Democrats who used to believe that we should have a very strict trade situation where we were benefiting and we were doing America First policies and not benefiting China. That Trump he took up that position on trade. He's courting unions. He's the first Republican to get a donation from the Teamsters Union, and the Teamsters chief is speaking at the RNC this year only because of Trump. He's courting Black voters. He's pro-gay. On all of these issues, Donald Trump is effectively a moderate Democrat from the 90s. So I would argue this is why they have to portray him as an extremist. They don't portray him as an extremist despite the fact that his policy is moderate. They portray him as an extremist because his policy is moderate, and they are very worried that the working class voters who they abandoned in the 90s will realize that there's actually a 90s era Democrat in the race. I think that Trump is running as a unity candidate on a consensus platform, and this has been obfuscated by the media, which is trying very hard to push Joe Biden because 96% of journalists in America are Democrats. And so the way that they have portrayed this race, it's between an old man and an extremist, when the reality is it's a race between a sort of bumbling far left person and a moderate Democrat. There is no real conservative in this race. And that's the argument I would make.
That's really helpful. Here's my perspective right now as I think about what the audience is thinking, right? Because we have a very diverse audience of very diverse backgrounds. And if I were to try to bucket them, it would be impossible. You need too many buckets. So here's the question that's coming to mind, right? You've articulated a perspective on Trump that would make the case that he is a unity consensus candidate that probably is a really good shot at winning the election right now. If I'm somebody that disagrees with your perspective, my question would be, I hear Batya making the claim that Trump is somebody that appeals to a majority of Americans, but the elites have created almost a facade that makes him seem particularly untenable and particularly extreme, right? And yet, last election in 2020, he lost by 7 million votes in the popular vote. So I'm just doing the math. 67 or 70 million people voted for, I think it was Trump. 77 million voted for Biden, or you subtract 7 either way. So to me, it would make the case that maybe it's not just an elite-driven phenomenon, but that the average person actually also finds something particularly untenable about Trump. Could you address and speak to that person?
Thank you so much for asking me that question. I mean, that's like exactly the question I should be asked in this moment, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to answer it. First of all, we know that wealth is the number one predictor for whether people will show up to vote. So there's a direct correlation between how much money you make and how much time you have to take that time off to go vote. So, that the fact that more, that he lost in 2020 and that a lot of people don't like him is not necessarily proof of my argument that the class divide is really a political divide today. I interviewed a lot of working class people for my book, Second Class. Some of them really don't like him. They don't like his personality. They don't like January 6th. They don't feel that they could vote for him. And I totally respect that. I respect people who feel that way. They have a place at the table. I don't think a landslide victory is necessarily a good thing for a democracy. I don't want it to be too close because then people won't be, happy. But it's good. We want political competition, right? We want
Mm,
people fighting for our votes. That's the best part, by the way, of Black men breaking for Trump is that the parties will now have to fight for Black voters. They'll actually have to deliver for them. Like, that is so great. Even if you're a Democrat, you should want that. You should want there to be competition for society's most vulnerable people and the people who are struggling the most. So yes, there are a lot of people who don't like Trump, but we do know at this point that 9 of the 10 richest counties now are controlled by Democrats. We know that 75% of journalists live in counties that are Democrat plus 20. Okay, so they don't even know Republicans anymore. We know that 97% of Silicon Valley donations go to Democrats. We know that Wall Street gave more money to Joe Biden than it did to Donald Trump because Wall Street really doesn't like Donald Trump. And the
mm.
Democrats have become very pro China and very pro cheap labor from failed socialist countries, which is great for Wall Street. So we're undergoing this realignment. And of course, it's not a perfect metric, right? There are a lot of people who are, first of all, the dependent poor, people who are actually poor and don't work. Those people are reliably Democrats because Democrats believe in, more welfare and not having any conditions on that. So there's always going to be poor people breaking for Democrats. But the working class, people making between $20,000 and $120,000 a year, who used to be able to get the American dream in exchange for hard work and now really no longer can. They can work and work and work and not achieve the American dream because of the way that the economy is set up to reward the people in the top and the people in the bottom. Those people, by and large, now see Donald Trump as a real champion for their economic needs and their economic success. Trump was the first president in 50 years to shrink the wealth inequality gap, something you will never hear in a Democrat controlled media outlet because it is so damning. For the side that sees itself as the side of social justice. So I don't know if I fully answered your question. I think the most
No,
important
I
thing
think
for me
I
to
think
say
you
is
yeah.
I really respect people who don't like him. I think that's a completely, and I respect people who don't think that he's good for their bottom line or good for the working class or good for the country. I totally respect that, and I want to have that conversation with people. And I'm really honored that you gave me the opportunity to talk about this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Batya, I think I actually think the silver lining in the tragedy of Saturday is that there's a unique opportunity where people that are very different than each other are giving themselves and each other a level of sympathy that I don't think you would have imagined, 5 days ago. And I think the silver lining, the opportunity right now is not that there's going to be unity. It's not that there's going to be compromise. I think what the silver lining right now is that people are willing to listen a little bit deeper than I think they were on Friday. And so
Love
like
that.
so really my objective is, I think there are people on this podcast and this audience and out there in the world that are like, "You know uh, what happened on Saturday was terrible, and I want to take a moment to listen." And so I appreciate you sharing that perspective. There's one last question I got to ask you. There's one last question I got to ask you. I know you got to run, but just one last quick question, which is, and I like to ask this of every guest as you run, which is, and I think you've touched on this a little bit, but what would you say your why is at this moment? Like, why do you put in so much work, so much effort into your career, into your time? Why do you do what you do right now?
Oh God, because I love this country and God put me in a position to be able to, I
Mm.
hope, it's my hope, make things a little bit better for my people. Um, I feel really, really honored and a little bit kind of astonished that people want to know what I think in this moment. And I feel really grateful to God that I have the space to think about things in a way that I think is unique and helpful. And I just feel really like beyond grateful that this is my job and this is my life and that I could maybe do a little bit of good for this country that I love so much.
Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much to Batya for joining. I thought that was a fascinating conversation, especially the end there. I hadn't heard that perspective before. This idea that uh, Trump was actually a Democratic candidate, a moderate Democrat from the 90s. I mean, it's a unique perspective. I had not shared that perspective before. And I think, again, that's the point of the show, is to hear from well-intentioned folks. Again, that's the key. Well-intentioned people with differing ideas from across the political spectrum, because what else is democracy about? Now, listen, we come at you at the Hopeful Majority every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content. Like or subscribe if you're on YouTube. Leave a review on Spotify and Apple. You and I are building this hopeful majority together, because if we want to, again, as Batya said, live in an environment, in a world in which we can listen to each other, disagree with each other, and have healthy conflict, as I've articulated, we've got to make our voices louder. And that's the hopeful majority. I'll see you next week.